Ethan Marlowe, a 45-year-old billionaire, sat in the shadow of his towering glass office building, watching the bustling city below through the tinted windows. From this height, the world seemed insignificant ants scurrying to and fro, unaware of the pain that could suffocate even the most powerful. It had been 3 years since he buried his only daughter, Emily. 3 years since the tragic accident that ripped her away, leaving Ethan with nothing but hollow echoes of his past self and the unbearable weight of guilt. The room behind him was a sterile fortress of modern luxury, sleek leather furniture, minimalist decor, and an almost obsessive cleanliness. But no matter how perfectly arranged his external world appeared, inside, Ethan's mind was chaos. The heart-shaped pendant he had commissioned for Emily on her 18th birthday haunted him, a simple yet elegant locket, engraved with the words, "Forever my sunshine." It was her favorite possession, the one thing she wore every day until it was buried alongside her in a mahogany casket he couldn't bring himself to approach during the funeral. Ethan's life had become a blur of meetings, stock market decisions, and half-hearted philanthropy. Each day began and ended the same, wrapped in cold precision. Emotions were weakness, and his world was built on steel and numbers. Yet tonight, something shifted. The city's neon lights, usually just a meaningless backdrop to his life, felt oppressive. He stepped out of his office and into the humid summer evening, deciding on a rare walk through the city streets. The city's pulse was different up close. The clamor of car horns, the sharp laughter of young couples, the quiet shuffling of the homeless, all of it collided into a symphony of chaos that Ethan found strangely grounding. He walked without purpose, letting the crowd push and pull him until he found himself on the outskirts of a crumbling neighborhood, a part of the city he hadn't seen in years. That's when he saw her. The woman was seated on the curb, hunched over, her hair matted and clinging to her face in greasy strands. Her clothes were little more than rags, and her thin, pale hands shook as she lifted a broken bottle to her lips. It wasn't her desolation that stopped Ethan in his tracks, it was the glint of something around her neck. In the flickering streetlight, he saw it, a familiar heart-shaped pendant dangling from a rusted chain. His chest tightened. No, it couldn't be. His mind raced as he moved closer, his polished leather shoes clicking against the cracked pavement. The woman looked up, her hollow eyes meeting his with a mixture of fear and defiance. She clutched the pendant with both hands, as though sensing his interest. "Where did you get that?" His voice, sharp and commanding, cut through the humid air. The woman flinched, pulling the pendant closer to her chest. "It's mine," she mumbled, her voice hoarse and barely audible. Ethan crouched in front of her, his heart pounding in his chest. The closer he looked, the more he was sure it was Emily's pendant. The engraving, the delicate craftsmanship, it was unmistakable. "That's not yours," he said, his voice trembling with anger and something deeper, something raw. "Where did you get it?" The woman glared at him, her fingers tightening around the locket. "Leave me alone," she snapped, her tone suddenly fierce. "You don't understand. It's all I have left." Ethan felt a wave of rage wash over him. This woman, this stranger, had no right to his daughter's memory. He reached forward, ready to rip the pendant from her neck, but she moved back, raising the broken bottle defensively. "Don't touch me," she shouted, her voice cracking. "You don't know what I've been through." Ethan froze, his outstretched hand falling to his side. The desperation in her voice gave him pause. For the first time, he looked beyond the pendant and truly saw her. Her sunken cheeks, the scars on her arms, the way her body trembled not from fear, but from exhaustion and hunger. "Please," he said, softening his tone. "I just need to know where you got it. That pendant, it belonged to someone important to me." The woman's defiance faltered. She looked down at the pendant, her fingers brushing over the engraving as though she were trying to remember something. "She gave it to me," the woman whispered, her voice barely audible. "She saved me." Ethan's breath caught. "Who? Who gave it to you?" The woman's eyes filled with tears, and she shook her head. "I don't know her name. She said her name wasn't important. She told me to keep it, that it would protect me." Ethan felt the ground shift beneath him. His mind refused to process her words. It didn't make sense. Emily was dead. She had to be. "Where?" he demanded, his voice shaking. "Where did you meet her?" The woman hesitated, her gaze darting around as though searching for an escape. "It was a long time ago," she said finally. "I was in a bad place. She found me, pulled me out before it was too late. She said she didn't have much time." Ethan's pulse quickened. "And then? What happened to her?" The woman shook her head again, tears streaming down her face. "She left. She said she had to go, that she couldn't stay. I haven't seen her since." Ethan stood, his mind racing. He didn't know what to believe. The logical part of him screamed that this was impossible, that this woman was delusional. But the part of him that had spent 3 years mourning his daughter's death clung to her words like a lifeline. "I need you to come with me," he said finally. The woman looked up at him, her tear-streaked face filled with suspicion. "Why?" "Because I need answers," he said, his voice firm. "And you're the only person who can give them to me." The woman hesitated, then slowly nodded. Ethan reached out a hand to help her stand, but she flinched away, pulling herself up with visible effort. As they walked through the dark streets, Ethan glanced at the pendant again, shining faintly under the streetlights. For the first time in 3 years, he felt something stir within him, a glimmer of hope, fragile and dangerous. If there was even the slightest chance that Emily was alive, he would stop at nothing to find her. And if this woman held the key to the truth, then he would do whatever it took to uncover it. Ethan sat across from the woman in his penthouse apartment, the stark contrast between their worlds creating an almost unbearable tension. She slouched in a chair that cost more than what she might have earned in her entire life, her dirty clothes leaving faint smudges on the pristine leather. Ethan, rigid and upright, leaned forward, his piercing gaze fixed on the heart-shaped pendant resting against her chest. It was the same one, there could be no doubt. The woman, who had reluctantly given her name as Claire, avoided his eyes. Her hands trembled as she clutched the steaming cup of tea Ethan's housekeeper had placed in front of her. The way she stared into the liquid, as though it might contain answers to questions she couldn't ask, filled the room with a heavy silence. "Start from the beginning," Ethan demanded, his voice firm but low, barely containing his rising frustration. "You said someone gave you that pendant. I need every detail, where, when, what she said." Claire's fingers tightened around the cup. She didn't answer immediately, instead taking a long sip of the tea. Her lips trembled, and for a moment, Ethan thought she might break down. But then she placed the cup on the table with surprising steadiness. "It was about 2 years ago," she began hesitantly, her voice rough, as though she hadn't spoken at length in years. I was at my lowest. I don't know if you've ever been there, but it's not the kind of place you crawl out of on your own. You need someone to pull you out." Ethan leaned forward, his fingers digging into his knees. "Who was she?" he pressed. Claire shook her head slowly. "I didn't ask her name. She didn't offer it. She just appeared. I was living in an abandoned building on the east side of the city, barely surviving. It was cold, so cold that winter. People froze to death in the alleys, and I thought maybe I'd be next." Her voice faltered, and she took another sip of tea, her eyes distant. Ethan waited, his patience running thin but knowing he couldn't interrupt. "I was lying there," Claire continued, her voice quieter now, "on the floor of that building. I didn't have a coat, and I couldn't feel my hands anymore. I thought, this is it. I wasn't scared, you know. I was just tired. I closed my eyes, waiting for it to end. Ethan felt a lump form in his throat despite himself. He clenched his jaw, forcing his emotions down. And then she came, Claire whispered, her voice barely audible. She was like a light in the dark. I don't know how else to describe it. She knelt next to me and wrapped a blanket around me. I thought she was a hallucination at first. Ethan's heart raced. What did she look like? He asked, his voice cracking slightly. Claire looked at him then, her sunken eyes meeting his for the first time since she started speaking. She looked fragile, she said slowly, like she'd been through hell and back. But her eyes were fierce, determined, like nothing in the world could break her. She had a scarf wrapped around her face, but I could see her eyes and hear her voice. She told me, "You're not dying today. Not on my watch." Ethan's breath caught. That sounded like Emily, her fiery spirit, her unyielding resolve. But it couldn't be. "What happened next?" he asked, his voice tight. "She dragged me out of there," Claire said, her gaze drifting back to the cup of tea. "Took me to a shelter. I don't know how she did it. She was so thin, like the wind could blow her away. But she carried me, step by step, until we reached help." "And the pendant?" Ethan pressed. "When did she give you that?" Claire hesitated, her fingers brushing against the locket. "It was when she left. I stayed at the shelter for a few weeks, but one day she came to see me. She said she had to go, that there were others she needed to help. She put this around my neck and said, 'This is my promise to you. Hold on to it, and don't give up.'" Ethan felt a surge of anger. "And you didn't ask her name? You didn't try to find out who she was?" Claire flinched at his tone, her hands gripping the locket defensively. "I didn't need to know her name," she snapped. "She saved my life. That's all that mattered." Ethan stood abruptly, pacing the room. His mind was a storm of conflicting thoughts. Could it really have been Emily? How could she have survived the crash? And if she was alive, why hadn't she come back to him? "She's dead," he said suddenly, his voice bitter. "Emily Marlowe died 3 years ago in a car accident. That pendant was buried with her. So unless you can give me a better explanation, I don't know what kind of sick game this is." Claire's eyes widened. "You're her father," she whispered, the realization dawning on her. Ethan turned to face her, his expression hard. "I buried my daughter," he said coldly. "And now you're telling me she's out there, giving away the one thing I thought was still with her. Do you have any idea what you're saying?" Claire stood shakily, her hands gripping the back of the chair for support. "I don't know what happened to her after she left," she admitted. "But she was alive. I know what I saw. And I know she carried something heavy, something she didn't want to talk about. Maybe she's running from something, or someone." Ethan's fists clenched at his sides. "If she's alive, I need to find her," he said, more to himself than to Claire. "I need to know the truth." Claire hesitated. "You might not like the truth," she said quietly. Ethan glared at her. "That's not your decision to make." The room fell into silence, the weight of the conversation pressing down on both of them. Finally, Claire spoke again, her voice barely a whisper. "There was one thing she said before she left," she murmured. Ethan froze. "What?" She said, "I'm not who I used to be. Tell no one you saw me." The words hit Ethan like a punch to the gut. He staggered back, his mind spinning. What could Emily have meant? "You're coming with me," he said finally, his voice firm. Claire blinked. "What? Where?" "To find her," Ethan said, his eyes blazing with determination. "If there's even the slightest chance that she's alive, I'm going to bring her home. And you're going to help me." Claire hesitated, fear flickering across her face. What if she doesn't want to be found? she asked quietly. Ethan's jaw tightened. Then I'll make her see reason. She's my daughter. I won't lose her again. As the night stretched on, Ethan made the necessary arrangements. Calls were made, favors were pulled, and a plan began to form. He didn't know where this path would lead, but one thing was certain: he wouldn't stop until he found Emily, no matter what it took. Claire sat in the corner, watching him with a mixture of apprehension and something else, something like hope. She didn't know what lay ahead, but for the first time in years, she felt like she was moving towards something instead of running away. The pendant glinted faintly under the soft light, a silent promise hanging between them. The next morning, Ethan awoke with a rare clarity of purpose. The faint light of dawn filtered through the sprawling windows of his penthouse, illuminating the silent figure of Claire curled up on the couch. She slept uneasily, shifting and murmuring in her sleep, as though even her dreams couldn't offer her peace. Ethan stood at the window, clutching a cup of coffee that had long gone cold, his mind racing through the events of the previous night. Could Emily really be alive? The possibility burned through him, igniting a fire he thought had long since died. But the questions clawed at him with equal ferocity. Why hadn't she come back to him? What could she be running from? He turned back to Claire, who stirred awake, blinking groggily. For a moment she looked lost, her eyes darting around the unfamiliar surroundings. Then her gaze landed on Ethan, and her expression hardened. "Morning," he said curtly, setting his coffee down. "We're leaving soon." "Leaving?" Claire asked, her voice scratchy from sleep. "Yes," Ethan replied. "We're retracing your steps. Every place you've been since the day you met her. If she's out there, I'll find her." Claire sat up slowly, running a hand through her disheveled hair. "You don't understand," she said. "It's been years. I don't even remember half the places I've been." "Try," Ethan snapped, his tone sharp. "Think. You said she found you in that abandoned building. We'll start there." Claire hesitated, clearly uncomfortable. "That place, it's not safe," she muttered. Ethan's eyes narrowed. "I don't care. If there's any clue there, we're going." Within an hour, they were on their way. Ethan's sleek black sub cut through the grimy streets of the city's outskirts, a stark contrast to the dilapidated buildings and trash-strewn alleys they passed. Claire sat stiffly in the passenger seat, her hands folded tightly in her lap. She seemed to shrink into herself the closer they got to their destination. When they arrived, Ethan parked in front of a crumbling, graffiti-covered building. The windows were shattered, and the faint stench of rotten mildew hung in the air. Claire hesitated as she stepped out of the car, glancing around nervously. "This is it," she said quietly. Ethan didn't wait for her to elaborate. He strode toward the building, his polished shoes crunching against broken glass and debris. Claire followed reluctantly, her arms wrapped around herself as though to ward off invisible ghosts. Inside, the air was thick and heavy. The dim light from the broken windows barely illuminated the graffiti-covered walls and piles of discarded belongings. Ethan scanned the room, his jaw tight. "Where exactly were you?" he asked. Claire pointed toward a dark corner. "Over there," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "That's where she found me." Ethan walked over, his sharp eyes searching for any detail, any sign that could lead him closer to Emily. His gaze landed on a pile of tattered blankets, now moldy and torn, and a faint rust-colored stain on the floor. "She carried me out of here," Claire said from behind him. "I was too weak to walk." Ethan's jaw clenched. "And she didn't say anything about where she was going?" "No," Claire replied. "She just said she didn't have much time, like she was in a hurry, like she was running from something." Ethan turned to her, his eyes burning with determination. "You said she brought you to a shelter. Which one?" Claire hesitated. It's not there anymore," she said. "They shut it down a year ago. I heard it burned down." Do you remember where it was? Ethan pressed. Claire nodded reluctantly. I think so. Without another word, they left the building and drove to the location Claire described. The shelter was gone, replaced by a charred, vacant lot. The blackened remains of the structure stood like a skeleton against the gray sky. Ethan stepped out of the car, his eyes scanning the wreckage. His frustration was mounting. If this place held any clues, they were buried in ash and debris. This isn't helping, he muttered under his breath. Claire stood beside him, her arms wrapped around herself. I told you it wouldn't be here, she said quietly. Ethan turned to her, his expression dark. Then think of something else, he snapped. Where else could she have gone? Who else might know something? Claire flinched at his tone but didn't argue. She stared at the wreckage for a long moment, then closed her eyes as though trying to summon a long-buried memory. There was someone, she said finally. A man. He worked at the shelter. He was the one who let her in that night. I don't remember his name, but he was older, maybe in his 60s. He said he'd been running shelters for years. Ethan's mind raced. An older man running shelters, someone like that would have connections, a network. If this man had seen Emily, he might know more. Do you know where to find him? Ethan asked. Claire shook her head. No, but I remember he used to talk about another shelter he worked at before this one. Somewhere near the river. It wasn't much, but it was a lead. Ethan drove them to the riverfront, stopping at every shelter they passed. Most of them were overcrowded, filled with people who had little interest in talking to an impatient billionaire. But after hours of searching, they finally found someone who recognized the description of the older man. Jack, the shelter worker said, leaning against the door frame. Yeah, I know him. He runs a place on the north side now. St. Mark's. I think it's called. Ethan didn't wait for further details. He and Claire drove to St. Mark's, arriving as the sun began to set. The shelter was a modest, run-down building, but it was clean and orderly compared to the chaos they'd seen earlier. Inside, they found Jack, a wiry man with gray hair and kind but tired eyes. He looked up from his desk as they entered, his expression wary. "Can I help you?" he asked. Ethan stepped forward. "I'm looking for someone," he said. "A young woman who might have come through one of your shelters a few years ago. Her name is Emily Marlowe." Jack's eyes narrowed slightly, and he leaned back in his chair. "That name doesn't ring a bell," he said cautiously. Ethan pulled out his phone and showed him a picture of Emily. "Her," he said. "Have you seen her?" Jack stared at the photo for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he sighed and rubbed the back of his neck. "She looks familiar," he admitted, "but I can't say for sure. A lot of people come through these shelters. It's hard to keep track." Ethan's frustration flared. "This isn't just some random girl," he snapped. "She's my daughter. And if you've seen her, I need to know." Jack held up his hands defensively. "Look, I get it," he said. "But you have to understand, people who come here, they're usually running from something. They don't always want to be found." Ethan's hands balled into fists at his sides. "I don't care what she's running from," he said through gritted teeth. "I need to find her." Jack studied him for a moment, then glanced at Claire, who had been silent until now. "You were at the East Side shelter, weren't you?" he asked her. Claire nodded hesitantly. Jack sighed again. "There was a girl who came through there a couple of years ago," he said slowly. "Didn't stay long. She was different. Quiet, but not scared. Like she'd been through something and come out the other side stronger. She didn't give her name, but she left an impression." Ethan's heart pounded. "Where did she go?" Jack hesitated. "She mentioned something about heading north," he said. "Said she had unfinished business. That's all I know." North? It wasn't much, but it was a direction. Ethan thanked Jack and turned to leave, but Jack stopped him. "Be careful," he said quietly. "If she's alive, there's a reason she's staying hidden, and the people who helped her might not want you finding her." Ethan didn't respond. He and Claire left the shelter and climbed back into the car, the weight of Jack's words hanging over them. "Do you really think she's alive?" Claire asked as they drove. Ethan's grip tightened on the steering wheel. "I don't know," he admitted. "But if she is, I'll find her, no matter what." As the car sped into the night, Ethan felt a surge of determination. This wasn't just about finding Emily anymore, it was about uncovering the truth, no matter how painful it might be. The engine hummed as Ethan's car sped through the long stretch of highway leading north. Night had fully fallen, wrapping the world in a blanket of darkness. Beside him, Claire sat silently, gazing out the window, her hands clenched tightly in her lap. The hum of the engine and the occasional rattle of wind against the windows were the only sounds filling the tense air between them. Ethan's mind churned, going over every word Jack had said at the shelter. Unfinished business. She's staying hidden for a reason. The idea gnawed at him. If Emily was alive, why would she choose to remain in the shadows? Why would she abandon him, her father, after everything they'd shared? They had been on the road for hours, stopping only briefly at remote towns to ask questions or restock on supplies. Each inquiry led them closer to the fringes of society, places where few dared to venture. Ethan wasn't sure if he was chasing a ghost or the faintest glimmer of hope, but the possibility of finding Emily drove him forward. Claire, on the other hand, grew more withdrawn with every mile. Her earlier defensiveness had given way to an uneasy silence. There were moments Ethan caught her stealing glances at him, as though she were on the verge of saying something, but she always looked away before a word escaped her lips. Finally she spoke. "What if she doesn't want to be found?" Ethan tightened his grip on the wheel, his knuckles turning white. "She's my daughter," he said through gritted teeth. "If she's alive, she'll want to see me." Claire hesitated, then turned her gaze back to the window. "You don't know that," she murmured. Ethan glanced at her, his frustration bubbling to the surface. "What are you trying to say?" he demanded. Claire flinched slightly but didn't back down. "I'm saying that sometimes people leave for a reason," she said quietly. "Sometimes they don't want to be pulled back." Ethan's jaw tightened. He didn't respond, but her words lingered in the air, heavy and unwelcome. As they neared their next stop, a small, weathered town nestled at the edge of a sprawling forest, the GPS flickered briefly before cutting out entirely. The dashboard screen glowed dimly, displaying an error message. Ethan cursed under his breath, pulling the car to the side of the road. "Great," he muttered, slamming the gear into park. Claire shifted uncomfortably. "Where are we?" Ethan checked the map on his phone, but the signal was weak, and the screen loaded painfully slowly. "Close to nowhere," he said grimly. "We'll have to find someone who can point us in the right direction." The town was eerily quiet as they entered, its streets illuminated only by the faint glow of a few streetlights. Most of the buildings were old and weathered, their paint peeling and windows shuttered. The occasional figure shuffled along the sidewalks, their heads down and their faces obscured by hats or hoods. Ethan parked the car near what looked like a diner, its neon sign buzzing faintly in the darkness. The inside was nearly empty, save for a waitress behind the counter and a lone man nursing a cup of coffee in the corner. The air smelled of grease and stale cigarettes. Claire hesitated at the door, clearly uncomfortable, but Ethan strode inside without a second thought. The waitress glanced up, her expression a mixture of boredom and mild curiosity. "Evening," Ethan said curtly. "We're looking for someone. A young woman who might have passed through here a couple of years ago. Blonde hair, early 20s. The waitress raised an eyebrow, chewing on a piece of gum. "You're going to have to be more specific," she said flatly. Ethan pulled out his phone and showed her a picture of Emily. Her, he said. Have you seen her? The waitress frowned, leaning closer to get a better look. Maybe, she said slowly. Can't say for sure. A lot of folks come and go around here. Ethan's patience was wearing thin. Do you remember anything? He pressed. Anything at all? Before the waitress could respond, the man in the corner spoke up. You're looking for the girl who stayed with the old preacher, aren't you? Ethan turned sharply to face him. What preacher? The man shrugged, setting his coffee cup down. Old guy. Lives out past the forest. People say he takes and strays folks who don't have anywhere else to go. Ethan's pulse quickened. Do you know where he is? The man nodded. Follow the road out of town. When you hit the tree line, take the dirt path to the left. It'll lead you to his place. Ethan didn't wait for further details. He tossed a bill onto the counter and turned to leave, but the man called after him. You might want to think twice before you go knocking on his door, he said. Ethan stopped, his hand on the doorframe. Why's that? The man hesitated, his expression unreadable. Let's just say, not everyone who goes looking for answers comes back with what they want. The warning lingered in Ethan's mind as they drove toward the forest. The road grew narrower and rougher the deeper they went, the trees closing in around them like towering sentinels. The air felt heavier here, laden with an almost tangible sense of foreboding. Finally, they reached the dirt path the man had mentioned. Ethan turned onto it, the car jostling over the uneven ground. The headlights cast long, shifting shadows on the trees, their gnarled branches clawing at the sky. They reached a small clearing, and there was a modest, weathered house with a sagging roof and a single light glowing in one of the windows. Ethan parked the car and stepped out, his eyes scanning the darkened forest around them. Claire followed hesitantly, her unease palpable. The door creaked open before they could knock, and an elderly man stepped out onto the porch. He was tall and thin, his face lined with deep wrinkles and his eyes sharp despite his age. Can I help you? He asked, his voice calm but wary. Ethan stepped forward. We're looking for someone, he said. A young woman who might have stayed here a couple of years ago. Her name is Emily Marlowe. The preacher's expression didn't change, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes, recognition, perhaps, or caution. Come inside, he said finally, stepping aside to let them in. The interior of the house was sparse but clean, the walls lined with shelves of books, and the faint scent of wood smoke hanging in the air. The preacher gestured for them to sit at the worn wooden table in the center of the room. I remember her, he said, his voice quiet. Ethan's heart leapt. You do? Where is she? Is she alive? The preacher held up a hand, his gaze steady. She was here, he said. But she didn't stay long. She was troubled. Said she was trying to outrun her past. Ethan leaned forward, his hands gripping the edge of the table. What happened to her? Where did she go? The preacher sighed. She talked about heading west, he said. But she didn't say much more than that. She was afraid of what I don't know. But she carried a heavy burden. Ethan's frustration boiled over. That's it? He snapped. That's all you know? The preacher's gaze hardened. I don't pry into the lives of the people who come here, he said. I offer them a place to rest, nothing more. If she didn't want to share her story, that was her choice. Claire spoke up for the first time, her voice tentative. Did she leave anything behind? Anything that might tell us where she went? The preacher hesitated, then stood and walked to a small cabinet. He opened it and retrieved a worn notebook, which he placed on the table in front of them. She left this, he said. Said it wasn't safe to keep with her anymore. Ethan snatched the notebook, his hands trembling as he flipped through its pages. The handwriting was unmistakably Emily's, but the contents were cryptic, half-finished thoughts, fragments of sentences, and strange symbols that looked like they belonged in an ancient manuscript. One phrase stood out, repeated several times throughout the notebook. The light always finds the truth. Ethan's pulse quickened. He didn't know what it meant, but he was certain of one thing: the search for Emily was far from over. And whatever truth she had been running from, it was now his to uncover. Ethan sat in the dim light of the preacher's kitchen, staring at the cryptic notebook left behind by Emily. The worn pages, covered in fragmented thoughts and strange symbols, felt like they held the answers just out of reach. His fingers traced over the phrase repeated in her handwriting: "The light always finds the truth." "What does it mean?" Claire asked quietly, seated across from him. Ethan didn't look up. His mind churned, trying to piece together the fragments of information they'd uncovered so far. "I don't know," he said finally. "But whatever it is, it was important to her. Important enough to leave behind." The preacher leaned against the doorframe, watching them with a measured gaze. "You should be careful," he said. "Sometimes the truth isn't what you're looking for, and sometimes it comes at a cost." Ethan ignored the warning. Cost didn't matter to him anymore. He'd already lost everything. If finding Emily meant tearing through every shadow of her past, then so be it. "Do you know what these symbols are?" Ethan asked, holding the notebook up. The preacher shook his head. "She never explained. Just said it was safer with me than out there. She was afraid someone might recognize it." Claire frowned. "Someone? Who?" "She didn't say," the preacher replied. "But she was looking over her shoulder the entire time she was here. Whatever she was running from, it wasn't just in her head." Ethan closed the notebook with a frustrated snap and stood. "We're leaving," he said, his voice clipped. "There's nothing more for us here." Claire followed him reluctantly as they stepped out into the cold night air. The preacher stood on the porch, watching them go. "Whatever you're chasing," he said as Ethan opened the car door, "just remember some things are meant to stay in the dark." Ethan didn't respond. He slid into the driver's seat, slamming the door shut, and started the engine. The headlights cut through the forest's suffocating darkness as they made their way back to the main road. Hours later, they stopped at a rundown motel on the edge of a desolate town. The fluorescent sign flickered weakly, casting eerie shadows on the cracked asphalt. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of mildew and stale cigarettes. Ethan sat at the small desk in their shared room, the notebook spread open in front of him. He couldn't stop staring at the symbols, their jagged, looping shapes pressing into his mind like an unsolvable puzzle. Claire sat on the bed, her knees pulled to her chest. "Maybe it's some kind of code," she suggested. Ethan didn't respond. His focus was elsewhere on a particular page near the end of the notebook. It was different from the rest, the handwriting messier, more frantic. A single sentence was scrawled across the page, over and over, as though Emily had written it in a state of panic. "They see the light, but they live in the shadows." "What the hell does that mean?" Ethan muttered, his frustration boiling over. Claire hesitated, then spoke cautiously. "It sounds like she's talking about a group. People who know something. Maybe they're the ones she was running from." Ethan's jaw clenched. "Then we need to find them," he said. Claire gave him a skeptical look. "And how do you plan to do that?" "Walk up to random people and ask if they've been hiding in the shadows." Ethan shot her a glare. This isn't the time for sarcasm. Before Claire could respond, there was a knock at the door. They both froze, exchanging a tense glance. "Did you tell anyone where we were staying?" Ethan asked, his voice low. Claire shook her head. The knock came again, louder this time. Ethan stood, grabbing the knife he'd taken to carrying in his coat pocket, and approached the door cautiously. "Who is it?" he called out. No response. Ethan glanced back at Claire, who had risen to her feet, her face pale with fear. Slowly he unlocked the door and opened it just wide enough to peer outside. A man stood in the shadows, his face obscured by a hood. He raised his hand slightly, a gesture of non-threatening intent. You're looking for answers, the man said, his voice calm and measured. I can help you. Ethan's grip on the knife tightened. Who are you? Someone who knows what you're up against, the man replied, and someone who knows what you've lost. Ethan's eyes narrowed. If you know something, start talking. The man stepped closer, just enough for the dim light from the hallway to illuminate his face. He was older, with sharp features, and a scar running down the side of his jaw. You're chasing someone who doesn't want to be found, the man said. And you're getting close to people who don't want you asking questions. Ethan opened the door wider, his expression hard. Who are these people? The man glanced down the hallway, as though checking for eavesdroppers. They call themselves the Order, he said. They hide in plain sight: charities, organizations, shelters. But their true purpose is something darker. Claire stepped forward, her voice trembling. The Order? What do they want? The man's gaze shifted to her. Control, he said simply. Over people, over information. They prey on the desperate, the broken. They take everything from you, your past, your identity, and turn you into something else. Something useful. Ethan's stomach turned. Are you saying they did this to my daughter? The man hesitated, then nodded. If she crossed paths with them, she's either one of them now, or she's dead. The words hit Ethan like a blow to the chest. He struggled to keep his composure, his mind reeling. How do I find them? He demanded. The man shook his head. You don't, he said. Not unless they want to be found. And trust me, you don't want their attention. The fact that you're still alive means they haven't decided you're a threat yet. Ethan stepped closer, his voice low and dangerous. I don't care what it takes. If they have my daughter, I'm going to get her back. The man studied him for a long moment, then sighed. There's a place, he said reluctantly. A safe house they use to recruit new members. It's in the mountains, about 50 miles north of here. But be warned, if you go there, you won't come back the same. Ethan didn't flinch. Tell me where it is. The man scribbled something on a scrap of paper and handed it to him. I hope you know what you're doing, he said, because once you step into their world, there's no going back. The road to the mountains was treacherous, winding through dense forests and steep cliffs. The air grew colder with each passing mile, the towering peaks looming like silent sentinels. Claire shifted uneasily in her seat. This feels like a trap, she said. Ethan didn't take his eyes off the road. It doesn't matter, he said. If there's even a chance she's there, I have to take it. They reached the safe house as the sun began to set. It was a sprawling, fortress-like structure nestled deep within the woods, its dark windows glinting in the fading light. Ethan parked the car at a distance and surveyed the area. There were no obvious guards, but the building exuded an air of menace, as though it were watching them. What's the plan? Claire asked nervously. Ethan's jaw tightened. We go in, he said simply. As they approached the building, the forest seemed to close in around them, the trees casting long, jagged shadows. The front door was unlocked, creaking ominously as Ethan pushed it open. Inside, the air was heavy and still. The faint hum of electricity buzzed in the background, and the walls were lined with strange, intricate symbols, the same ones from Emily's notebook. Claire shivered. This place feels wrong, she whispered. Ethan didn't respond. His focus was on the long hallway stretching before them, each step echoing like a warning. They entered a large room at the end of the hall, its walls covered in faded photographs and documents. In the center of the room stood a table, and on it lay something that made Ethan's blood run cold. Emily's pendant. Ethan's hands trembled as he picked it up, the familiar weight sending a surge of conflicting emotions through him. She had been here recently. Before he could process the discovery, a voice echoed from the shadows. You've come a long way, Mr. Marlowe. Ethan spun around, his heart racing. A figure stepped out of the darkness, their face obscured by a mask. "Who are you?" Ethan demanded. The figure tilted their head, their voice calm and measured. "The question isn't who I am," they said. "It's who you're willing to become to find her." Ethan's grip on the pendant tightened as the room seemed to close in around him. He had come too far to back down now. "Where is she?" he growled. The figure chuckled softly, a sound that sent chills down Ethan's spine. "You'll find out soon enough," they said. "But first, you'll have to prove you're worthy of the truth." The lights flickered, and the room was plunged into darkness. The darkness swallowed the room whole, leaving Ethan disoriented. The pendant still dangled from his clenched fist, the last tangible proof that Emily had been there. His breathing quickened, and his heart thundered in his chest, but he refused to falter. Somewhere in this labyrinth of shadows was his daughter, or the truth about what had happened to her. A faint light flickered ahead, drawing his attention. It wasn't bright, it barely illuminated the edges of the room, but it was enough to create the silhouette of the masked figure standing at the far end. "Your determination is admirable," the figure said, their voice calm, almost soothing. "But determination alone won't bring her back." Ethan took a step forward, his voice low and dangerous. "If you know where she is, you'll tell me. Now." The figure chuckled softly. "You still don't understand, do you? This isn't about finding her. It's about finding yourself, about understanding what you're willing to sacrifice to reach the light." Ethan's jaw tightened. He was done with their cryptic games. "I've already sacrificed everything. You don't scare me." The figure tilted their head slightly, as though studying him. "Good," they said, "because fear will only hold you back. Come with me. It's time for you to see." Without waiting for a response, they turned and walked toward the light. Ethan hesitated for only a moment before following, his knuckles white around the pendant. Claire trailed behind him, her footsteps hesitant and her breath shallow. The narrow corridor seemed to stretch endlessly, the faint light ahead leading them deeper into the unknown. Strange symbols, like the ones from Emily's notebook, were etched into the walls, glowing faintly as they passed. Ethan's stomach churned at the sight of them. What did they mean? Why had Emily been drawn into this? The corridor opened into a vast chamber, dimly lit by dozens of flickering candles arranged in a circular pattern. In the center of the room stood a simple wooden chair, and beside it, a tall mirror encased in an ornate frame covered in intricate carvings. Ethan's eyes narrowed. "What is this?" The figure turned to face him. "This is where it begins," they said. "Where you begin. Sit." Ethan didn't move. His instinct screamed that this was a trap, but his desperation outweighed his caution. "I'm not playing your games," he said coldly. "Where is my daughter?" The figure gestured to the chair. "Everything you seek is on the other side," they said. "But to see the truth, you must first face yourself." Claire grabbed Ethan's arm. "Don't do it," she whispered. This feels wrong." Ethan shook her off gently but firmly. "I have to," he said, his voice firm. He stepped toward the chair, his movements deliberate. As he sat, the figure stepped closer, their mask gleaming faintly in the candlelight. "The mirror will show you what you need to see," they said. "But be warned, the truth is not always kind." Ethan's reflection stared back at him, distorted slightly by the age and wear of the glass. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, slowly, the surface of the mirror began to ripple, as though it were a pool of water disturbed by an invisible hand. Images began to form in the glass, blurry at first, then sharpening into clarity. Ethan's breath caught as he saw himself standing in his office, yelling into his phone. He recognized the moment immediately. It was the day of the accident. "Emily," he whispered. The scene shifted, showing Emily standing in the doorway of his office, her face tight with frustration and sadness. She was trying to tell him something, but he had waved her off, too consumed by his work to pay attention. The mirror showed the rest Emily storming out of the office, tears in her eyes, and climbing into her car. The reflection shifted again, this time showing the crash. Ethan watched in horror as the car skidded off the road and rolled into a ravine, the sound of screeching metal echoing in his ears, even though the room was silent. He clenched his fists, his knuckles turning white. "I already know this," he growled. "Show me something useful." The mirror rippled again, and this time the image was different. It showed Emily lying on a stretcher, surrounded by paramedics. Her face was pale, her breathing shallow. Then a figure stepped into view, a woman in a white coat, her face obscured. She leaned over Emily, whispering something to the paramedics. The scene shifted once more, showing Emily being wheeled into a dimly lit room. The woman in the white coat followed, closing the door behind them. Ethan's stomach twisted. "Who is she?" he demanded, his voice rising. The figure beside him tilted their head. "She is the gatekeeper," they said. "The one who chooses who stays in the light and who is cast into the shadows." The reflection faded, leaving only Ethan's pale, strained face staring back at him. He stood abruptly, knocking the chair over in the process. "Where is she?" he shouted, his voice echoing off the chamber walls. The figure didn't flinch. "She's beyond the mirror," they said simply. Ethan's heart raced. He turned to the mirror, his reflection glaring back at him. "How do I get to her?" The figure stepped closer. "To pass through, you must let go of everything that holds you back," they said. "Your anger, your guilt, your fear. Only then will the light accept you." Ethan stared at the mirror, his mind racing. Letting go. He couldn't. His anger was what drove him. His guilt was what kept him going. Without them, he was nothing. Claire's voice broke through his thoughts. "Ethan, you don't have to do this," she said, her voice trembling. This doesn't feel right. What if it's a trap? What if they're lying to you?" Ethan turned to her, his expression hard. "If there's even a chance she's on the other side, I have to take it," he said. Claire hesitated, then nodded reluctantly. "Then I'm going with you," she said. The figure chuckled softly. "Only one may pass," they said. "The choice is his alone." Ethan took a deep breath, his hands clenching and unclenching at his sides. He turned back to the mirror, staring into his reflection's eyes. Slowly, he reached out, his fingers brushing the cool surface of the glass. The mirror rippled again, the surface shimmering like liquid. Ethan felt a strange pull, as though the mirror were drawing him in. He closed his eyes and stepped forward. The sensation was disorienting, like being submerged in freezing water and pulled through a tunnel. When he opened his eyes, he was no longer in the chamber. He stood in a vast, empty field bathed in blinding white light. The air was still, and the silence was deafening. In the distance, he saw a figure small, delicate, and unmistakably familiar. "Emily," he whispered, his voice breaking. She turned, her blonde hair glowing in the light. Her eyes met his, and for a moment he saw the daughter he had lost. But her expression was guarded, her posture stiff. "Dad?" she said, her voice uncertain. Ethan ran toward her, his heart pounding. "Emily, it's me. I've been looking for you." She took a step back, her gaze wary. "You shouldn't be here," she said. Ethan froze. "What? What are you talking about? I came to bring you home." Emily shook her head. "I don't belong there anymore," she said. "I made my choice." Ethan's chest tightened. "What choice? What did they do to you?" "They showed me the truth," she said. "The world you live in, it's a lie. I had to leave it behind." Ethan reached for her, desperation in his eyes. "Emily, you don't have to do this. You don't have to stay here. You're my daughter. You belong with me." She hesitated, her expression torn. "I'm not who I used to be," she said softly. "And I can't go back." Ethan felt his heart shatter. Tears streamed down his face as he pleaded with her. "Emily, please. I can't lose you again." She stepped closer, placing a hand on his chest. "You never lost me, Dad," she said. "I'll always be with you. But this is where I'm meant to be." Before he could respond, the light around them grew brighter, engulfing everything. Ethan closed his eyes against the brilliance, and when he opened them again, he was back in the chamber. The figure stood before him, their mask glinting in the candlelight. "You found her," they said, "but the truth is never easy to accept." Ethan sank to his knees, the pendant clutched tightly in his hand. Emily was alive, but she was no longer his. And as the weight of that realization settled over him, he understood that his journey had only just begun. Ethan knelt on the cold stone floor of the chamber, the heart-shaped pendant still gripped in his hand. His chest felt hollow, his breathing shallow, as if the air itself refused to fill his lungs. The figure in the mask stood over him, watching in silence. The flickering candles cast long shadows on the walls, dancing like specters of his failure. "She's alive," Ethan whispered, his voice trembling. "She's alive, but I can't bring her back." The figure tilted their head, their voices calm as ever. "Not all paths lead home," they said, "and not all who walk away are lost. She has chosen her place in the light." Ethan's grip on the pendant tightened, until the sharp edges bit into his palm. "You took her from me," he said, his voice low and filled with fury. "You broke her, twisted her into something I don't recognize." The figure didn't flinch. "We didn't take her," they said. "She came to us willingly. She sought freedom from the burdens of her past, a past you were part of." The words were a dagger to Ethan's heart. His mind raced with memories of all the moments he had pushed Emily aside, all the times his work had come first, and all the ways he had failed her without even realizing it. He stood, his legs unsteady but his resolve hardening. "I don't care what she chose," he said through gritted teeth. "She's still my daughter, and I won't let you erase her." The figure stepped back, gesturing toward the doorway behind them. "The choice is no longer yours," they said. "You've seen the truth. Now you must decide what to do with it." Ethan turned and stormed out of the chamber, his steps echoing through the corridor. Claire was waiting in the hallway, her eyes wide with worry. "What happened?" she asked. "She's alive," Ethan said curtly, pushing past her. Claire hurried after him. "Alive? Where is she? Did you see her?" Ethan didn't respond. His mind was a whirlwind of anger, guilt, and determination. He didn't stop until they were outside, the cold night air hitting him like a slap. The masked figure's words echoed in his mind. She sought freedom from the burdens of her past. Claire grabbed his arm, forcing him to stop. "Ethan, talk to me," she pleaded. "What happened in there?" He looked at her, his eyes blazing. "They've brainwashed her," he said. "Convinced her to abandon everything she was, everything we had. But I'm not giving up. I'll tear that place apart if I have to." Claire hesitated, then shook her head. "What if she doesn't want to come back?" she asked softly. Ethan's expression hardened. "She doesn't know what she wants. They've poisoned her mind. She's my daughter, and I'm going to save her, even if she hates me for it." The days that followed were a blur of action. Ethan threw himself into uncovering every detail about the organization, the order, the masked figure, and the enigmatic phrase Emily had left behind. "The light always finds the truth." He used every resource at his disposal, digging into financial records, charitable foundations, and private networks. The deeper he delved, the more disturbing the picture became. The Order wasn't just a fringe group, they were deeply entrenched in society, operating under the guise of philanthropy and humanitarian aid. Their reach was vast, their influence insidious. But Ethan wasn't deterred. He'd faced hostile takeovers, corporate sabotage, and lawsuits that could bankrupt nations. This was no different. Claire stayed by his side, though her reservations were clear. "Ethan, you're fighting an enemy you can't see," she said one night as they pored over documents in his penthouse. "Even if you find them, what are you going to do? March in there and demand they give her back?" Ethan didn't look up from the papers. "If that's what it takes," he said. Claire sighed, rubbing her temples. "You're not listening to me. What if she doesn't want to come back? What if this is her choice?" Ethan's jaw tightened. "She doesn't get to make that choice," he said coldly. "Not while they're manipulating her." Weeks later, Ethan finally uncovered a lead, a hidden facility nestled deep in the mountains, registered under a shell company tied to the order. It matched the descriptions he'd pieced together from the preacher and the masked figure. Claire was reluctant to accompany him, but Ethan insisted. "You were there when she saved you," he said. "She trusted you enough to give you her pendant. If there's any part of her that remembers who she is, it'll respond to you." The drive to the facility was long and tense. The mountain roads were treacherous, and the air grew colder with every mile. When they finally arrived, the building loomed before them, a stark, imposing structure that seemed to absorb the light around it. Ethan parked the car and stared at the facility, his heart pounding. "This is it," he said. Claire hesitated. "What if we're walking into a trap?" Ethan didn't answer. He got out of the car and approached the facility, the pendant clutched tightly in his hand. Inside, the air was sterile and cold, the walls lined with monitors displaying live feeds from various rooms. The facility was eerily quiet, but Ethan could feel the weight of unseen eyes watching him. As they moved deeper into the building, they found a series of rooms filled with strange equipment, chairs with restraints, screens displaying hypnotic patterns, and shelves lined with files. Ethan grabbed one of the files, flipping through it quickly. His breath caught when he saw Emily's name scrawled across the top. The file contained detailed notes about her psychological profile, her progress, and her reassignment. "She's here," he said, his voice tight. They continued searching until they reached a large, circular room. In the center stood a chair, and seated in it was Emily. Ethan's heart stopped. She looked different. Her hair was shorter, her face thinner, and her eyes colder. But it was her. "Emily," he said, his voice breaking. She looked up at him, her expression blank. "Dad?" Ethan rushed forward, but she held up a hand to stop him. "You shouldn't be here," she said. "I came to bring you home," he said. Her eyes flickered with something, recognition maybe, or hesitation. "This is my home now," she said. "You don't understand." "Then help me understand," Ethan pleaded. "Tell me what they did to you." Emily hesitated, her gaze shifting to Claire. "You brought her," she said softly. "Good. She's proof that the light works." Ethan frowned. "What are you talking about?" Emily stood, her movements deliberate. "The order showed me the truth," she said. "They freed me from my past, from my pain. I'm better now, stronger." "You're not better," Ethan said firmly. "You're not free. They've twisted you into something you're not." Emily stepped closer, her eyes hard. "And what if this is who I've always been?" Ethan's chest tightened. "Emily, please, come home with me. We can fix this. Together." She hesitated, her gaze softening for just a moment. But then the coldness returned. "I can't," she said. "I belong here. And so do you." Before Ethan could respond, the door behind him slammed shut, and the room was flooded with light. Voices echoed from hidden speakers, their words cryptic and disorienting. "The light reveals all," they said, "but only the worthy may see." Ethan turned to Claire, his mind racing. "We need to get out of here," he said. But Claire was staring at Emily, tears streaming down her face. "Emily, please," she said. "Don't let them do this to you. You're stronger than this." For a moment, Emily's facade cracked. Her eyes filled with pain and her hands trembled. I don't know who I am anymore, she whispered. Ethan seized the moment. You're my daughter, he said, and that's all that matters. Emily's resolve wavered, but before she could respond, alarms blared, and the room was flooded with guards. Ethan grabbed her hand, pulling her toward the exit. We're leaving, he said. Emily didn't resist. Together, they fought their way out of the facility, dodging guards and navigating the labyrinthine halls. When they finally burst into the open air, Ethan felt the weight lift from his chest. They had made it out. Weeks later, back in the safety of his home, Ethan watched as Emily began to piece herself back together. The process was slow, and the scars of her time with the Order ran deep, but for the first time in years, he felt hope. You saved me, Emily said one evening, her voice quiet. Ethan shook his head. No, he said, you saved yourself. I just reminded you of who you are. As they sat together, the pendant glinting in the soft light, Ethan finally let himself believe that they could move forward together.